Morning, friends. It's Elizabeth Murphy with the Bible More Than You Expected. Sorry, I have a really bad cold, so my voice sounds weird. It is week 2, lesson 4, Mark chapter 9. And before I start talking to you about Mark chapter 9, I want to talk for just a minute about the very end of Mark chapter 8, because there's a shift happening here. You know, in the beginning of Mark, things are fast-paced, and it's sort of a shotgun-like soundbite report on the things that Jesus is doing. And he's been doing things that were very Messiah-like, big and powerful. And all of a sudden, things begin to change, because at the very end of Mark chapter 8, he starts to talk to them about what it looks like to follow Jesus. And he's talking to these Jewish men who all of their lives have heard about this Messiah who is going to come and save the Jewish people from their oppressors. And so they're expecting a military king, and they know that Jesus, or at least Peter has acknowledged Jesus is this Messiah who's going to save the people. And they've seen him look very Messiah-like, but now they're about to hear him start talk about things like suffering and being last instead of first and things like that. And they're so confused. They are trying, I think I talked last time about this sort of show and tell. Well, the first part of Mark is all about the show and the big, powerful things Jesus does. But he also says, don't tell anybody. I think he wanted to be the one to tell, and now it's time to tell. And so at the end of Mark chapter 8, he says, this is what it looks like to follow me. The first will be last, and the last will be first. And you'll have to carry a cross. And you can't have the whole world and your soul at the same time. And all of that will come about because he will suffer. And they're confused. They don't know what that is. And so that's how Mark chapter 8 ends. And then at the beginning of Mark chapter 9, the transfiguration happens. And what is that? Well, Jesus takes 3 of his disciples. He takes Peter, James, and John. No idea why those 3, but those 3. To the top of a high mountain. And in scripture, big things happen on the top of high mountains. That's where Moses gets the 10 commandments, and he goes to meet face to face with God as he's helping the Israelites find their way out of Egypt. And here Jesus takes these 3. And when they get up there, what they see is they see Jesus transfigured. And he is white. His clothing is whiter than white, brighter than the sun. It says that in another place. And his whole countenance glows. And then they see him with Elijah and Moses. And Peter, the go guy, gets excited and says, Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. We should stay. We should build 3 houses, one for you and Moses, one for Moses and one for Elijah. And then a cloud descends upon them. And they hear that same voice they heard, or that was heard when Jesus was baptized. And it says, this is my son, whom I love. Listen to him. And then the cloud disappears. In the book of Matthew, when it describes the transfiguration, it says the disciples fell on their faces. I think they were terrified. But when the cloud disappears, it's them and Jesus. And he says some things that confuse them. But he also tells them to be quiet. Don't tell is what he says. And they come down off the mountain. And what does that say to me about God? What do I know about God because of what I read about the transfiguration? Well, I don't know if this is about God, but I'm trying to figure out, or I've been asking, why is this here? And in my just interpretation of why this is here, they've watched him do all of these Messiah-like powerful things, and yet he's told them he's going to be so different than what they expect. But the transfiguration, it's a picture of ultimately what it will be like for Jesus when he returns to the heaven he came from, in the presence of God, where he came to be with man. And the fact that Moses is there, these are Jewish men who've had this law they've had to follow their whole lives, and the sacrificial system and things like that. And Jesus is the fulfillment of that law. That law we couldn't fulfill no matter how hard we tried. We were never going to be right enough for that. And the point of it was to show us how wrong we really were. And Jesus comes to be the fulfillment because he is the right one. And so the fact that Moses was with him on the mountain says This is the fulfillment of the law. The Messiah has come. I am that Messiah that was talked about in the Old Testament. And it's Elijah being there. Maybe that has to do with the fact that it says a man like Elijah would come and point the way toward this Messiah. Well, that man like Elijah had come. His name was John the Baptist. And so it was as if this is there to say, here's what your expectation was. Here's what the end result is going to be. And I want to give you the hope of that. But then in the middle, there's this big suffering part that you don't understand. I don't know why it's there. That's my interpretation of why it's there. And what that tells me about God is he wants us to understand as best we can. As best we can. We're never fully going to understand. It's full of mystery and faith. But I do think he gives us glimpses in the hope that we can hang on to the parts we do understand until we understand fully. I think it's also there to show us, like God has shown us every time. He's a promise keeper. He said he was sending a Messiah, and Jesus is that Messiah. In Matthew chapter 2, when it talks about the prophecy of Jesus' birth, it says he'll be a shepherd king. Well, they were expecting a military king and a conquering hero and a victorious warrior, and what they ended up with was a shepherd. And shepherds lay down their lives for their sheep. If you ever read about a shepherd and what they do for their sheep, it's very, very different than what a military warrior would do on behalf of his people. And Jesus was to be that shepherd king, so he's a promise keeper. He promised a Messiah, and he delivered one. It also tells me about God that he wants us to listen to Jesus. You know, that voice says, "This is my son." When we hear about that voice in Jesus' baptism, it says, "You are my son." But here it says, "This is my son," as if to say, yep, this is that Messiah. But it says, listen to him. God could have said any number of things. He could have said, follow him. He could have said, obey him. He could have said, trust him. But he says, listen. What if he'd said, watch? All that they'd seen said something very different than what they were hearing now about the suffering, about the first is last, the reversal. And I think God is saying, listen carefully to his words. I think that was a command for them, and I think it's also a command for us, which is why reading the Bible is important. It's his word, his words to us. And so when he says listen to him, he means it. And he's given us a way to do that, that we have this scriptures. We have these scriptures. So he wants us to listen to Jesus. The other thing it said to me about God is all we need is Jesus. You know, they close their eyes or the cloud leaves and it's them and Jesus. Moses is gone. Elijah is gone. Moses represented the past and the path that we were trying to do everything right and we couldn't. And we still try to do everything right and we can't. And all of our best efforts won't matter. And John the Baptist was pointing to Jesus. And that was Elijah, a man like Elijah. But check, that's done too. Here he is, he's been revealed. And so we don't need the works don't matter, our efforts don't matter. We need just Jesus. And that's what we're left with when the cloud leaves on the mountain. What does this tell me about me, about us, about mankind? Well, for one thing, it tells me I don't want to suffer and serve. I'm much more comfortable. My desire is for ease and service. And not a lot has changed. I think they didn't want to suffer and serve either. Ease and service looked pretty good to them too. But I need to get a grip on that. I need to understand who I am in light of who Jesus is. The second thing it told me about me is God was very clear that it's our expectations that get in the way. You know, we are surprised when life is hard because we expect it to be easy. It really should be the other way around. He tells us in his word, in this world you will have trouble. Not you might, but you will. But take heart, for I have overcome this world. And he has. And life is going to be hard because we're broken people living in a broken world. But we can take heart in the midst of that because he has overcome the world. And my expectations are most of the time what get in the way of my understanding of that. And that's what was getting in the way for the disciples too. What it also tells me is that I like mountaintop experiences. I'm a lot like Peter. I say, this is good. I think we should stay here. And I think we should build a house. I'm pretty good with that too. But that's not the Jesus way. He wants us to come down off the mountain. and to go to the trenches where the people are. And he wants us to serve them and serve alongside them and show them our suffering servant Savior. When they come down off the mountain, excuse me, in verses 14 through 32, they kind of walk right smack into the middle of an argument in a crowd. When my kids were little and I'd go out of town and then I'd come back, I think that's how I felt. It was like the re-entry. It was like back to reality. They've come off the mountain and they've come back to reality. And they walk into the middle of an argument between the teachers of the law and the disciples and a father who has brought his son. And this son is possessed by a spirit, an evil spirit, a demon. I don't have an explanation for that. But I think that kind of thing is still happening. The best I can do is maybe, this is what it looks like in our culture. You know, we might not foam at the mouth, but sometimes the words that come out of our mouths are pure evil. And we might not writhe on the ground convulsed by an evil spirit, but we make choices, and our children make choices that throw us down into the dirtiest parts of life, and we writhe around in pain because we know this isn't the way it's supposed to be. The part I can resonate with here is that there's a father watching his child suffer. And as parents, sometimes we stand by and watch our children suffer in a broken world as broken people. So that's the person I most resonated with in this part of the story. But the argument is about the disciples wanting to know, having tried to cast out this spirit, this demon, and not being able to do it. And the father jumps in and says, I brought my son to you. I don't have the exact words here, but he says, teacher, I brought you my son. And Jesus says, and then the father also says, if you can, do something, help us, have pity on us. And Jesus says, if I can, anything is possible for him who believes. The father says, I do believe, but help my unbelief. And then the disciples go on to say, you know, we tried to cast this out. Why didn't it work? Why didn't it work? They didn't say, why didn't it happen? They say, why couldn't we do it? And if you notice, there's kind of a change of scene here. You know, they're in the crowd, and Jesus casts out this demon, and he says to the father, bring your son to me, and the demon goes away, and the son appears dead, and Jesus lifts him up, helps him to rise up. It's sort of resurrection language. And then they leave that scene and they go into a house, and I love that. I like changes of scene because Jesus is about to kind of scold them, and I like it that he's not doing that in public. And then they talk about, why couldn't we do this? Well, what does all of that say? Oh, Jesus tells them, because it's only possible with prayer. That's his answer to their question. Why couldn't we do that? Well, what does all of this say about God? It says to me that he does want us to grow in our faith as we learn more of him. That help my unbelief. The Father's saying, I have some belief. I need more. I want more. This same story in the Gospel of Matthew is where Jesus talks about faith as small as a mustard seed. It's a very small seed. And he says, if you have a little and you come to me and say, I believe in you a little, but I want to believe in you a lot. I want to trust you more. I want to grow more. He'll help us do that. That was my next thing, is that God will help us grow. He's the best place to go with your unbelief. I take my unbelief all kinds of other places. I ask friends. I ask family members. I ask my husband. I ask my church, help my unbelief. And they can. But the only one that can really make a difference is Jesus. So he will help us grow. He's patient with us in the process. You know, at one point he expresses it looks like frustration with the disciples. How long do I have to be with you to help you? I don't think that's frustration. I think that's urgency, because he is coming to the end of his earthly ministry here. The suffering is about to begin. And he knows they're running out of time. I think he feels that way about us too. You know, not because we have an eternity to look forward to if we have a relationship with Christ, but it's bigger than that. It's also about our everyday. He desires to make our everyday walking around, living your life better. And so I think he has this same urgency toward us. He wants us to understand. So he's patient in the process, but he's also urgent and he's expectant. The last one I wrote is, it's a process. I love this language change in Mark where it talks about on the road and passed through the town and in the house and sitting down. He sits down to talk to them. You know, I said that last week, Jesus is not all about intensity. Yeah, there is a lot of intensity, but he's really all about the intimacy. Because what he's doing in this Mark chapter 9 that's different is he's teaching them in a way that he hasn't taught them before. And it's personal, and it involves sitting down and talking face to face. That's why I think it's interesting, the transfiguration, God says, listen to him. And I think God's saying, listen to him. He'll sit with you. He'll talk with you. He'll help you. Listen to him. Well, what does all that say to me, we, mankind? Well, I wrote down, be careful of asking those close to Jesus to do what only Jesus can do. The Father said, teacher, I brought you, my son, and we should go to him. It's easy to be friends with Jesus' friends. Some people think, I've heard that quote, it's easier to be friends with Jesus' friends than it is to be friends with Jesus, because he'll hold us to account and he'll call out our behavior and he'll point the way we should go. And when we choose not to, our disobedience is very clear and uncomfortable. And so those who ask others to do what only Jesus can do, I think those are those that settle for nearby. They settle for nearby. It's the friends who ask for prayer without praying. It's those who get their Bible from others. Bless you, my husband's sneezing. Those who get their Bible from others without ever opening the Bible for themselves. Those who check off church on Sunday and consider it done. We need to be careful. We need a relationship with the living God for ourselves. The next thing it said to me was, I need to be careful not to limit God. I think that's what the Father was saying. I believe in you, but my belief has limits. And faith has no limits. The better we know God, the more we know God, the bigger our faith can be. You know, the leper, when he talked to Jesus and he asked for something, he said, if you are willing. That's sort of like, thy will be done. The Father said, if you can. There's a big difference. A big difference. If you can means I have limits and I don't want them. We need to be careful not to limit God. The next thing I learned is the importance of a prayerful life. You know, we saw in Mark chapter 1 at the very end, Jesus goes off to a quiet place for prayer. Jesus had a prayerful life. I read this quote and it helped me to kind of put in perspective why this matters so much. We can't get ready for the moment by quickly uttering a special prayer. We have to be ready through a prayerful life when the moment comes. When the moment comes, it reveals us. And if there's a prayerful life there, a whole different us will show up. So the importance of a prayerful life. I don't think the disciples had grasped that yet. I'm not sure they had a prayerful life yet. Because the next thing I wrote about we, is the disciples were on their own, both physically and spiritually. They were separated from Jesus. He was on the mountain with Peter, James, and Paul. Not Paul, Peter, James, and John. It says in the text that the people were so grateful when Jesus showed up. They were overwhelmed with gratitude, or I'm not sure those are the exact words, but that's my impression of how they felt. Oh, thank goodness he's here. Well, they could be separated physically. We can't be. He's with us all the time. He's here all the time. But we can be separated spiritually when we give up on a prayerful life, when we don't spend time filling ourselves up with all that he has to offer. They said, why couldn't we? Not why didn't it happen? That tells me they were trying to do things in their own power. They wanted a method. They wanted a plan. If you just tell us the steps, we can do this. There are no steps. It's not about the procedure. It's about the person of Jesus. And they had separated themselves from him and were working on their own. The next one I wrote was, it's a huge temptation, excuse me, to trust in my own gifts and abilities to do God's work. And this goes hand in hand with a prayerful life. If you make a regular confession part of your prayer life, it'll help you remember that you have no power on your own. We're moving on. They start talking about who is the greatest in verses 33 through 36. And they've changed locations, and they've traveled on the road a bit. And now they're entering into another conversation. And Jesus says, what were you talking about? And they don't want to tell him. I think they don't want to tell him like we don't want to tell him, because it wasn't their best selves that were talking about who's the greatest. And Jesus says, you're never going to be the greatest if you follow me. It's about last, not first. And he brings a child in. And I think he brings a child in because in their day, they treated children differently than we treat children. We hover and helicopter and put them on a pedestal and work ourselves senseless trying to make their lives right. And they were very low on the honor scale of the time. And Jesus said, if you want to follow me, if you want to work with me, walk with me, serve the ones that are low on the honor scale. That tells me that God says, do it differently, not like the world does, like I do. What that tells me about me is that's pretty hard. And God keeps trying, and he keeps teaching, and he talks to them again about his suffering. And they go on and they talk about this man who's trying to cast out demons in the name of Jesus. And I think they're jealous. Jesus says, don't be jealous. If you see something that looks Jesus-like in the behavior of another, accept it. Take an act of kindness as an act of kindness in my name. There's no place for jealousy and judgment in my kingdom. I bring jealousy and judgment a lot. And lastly, he talks to them about salt. He talks to them about cutting off their hand and their foot. And he's really talking about sin and the giant struggle against it. And the sin in our lives can cause others to struggle. And the gravity of the sin in our own lives. I think what he's saying, first of all, he's using hyperbole. He doesn't want to go cut their hands and feet off. It's an overstatement because an overstatement is needed. This is a big situation. And I think what he's saying is we need to be more worried about the evil within than the evil without. Check yourself. Check your heart. All of this is related. You could see their attitude of self-importance. You could see their attitude of self-confidence, the ability to behave on their own, the disciples. And then that goes into this conversation about the greatest. And the whole time he's going, the least, the suffering, the sin, the servant. Keep in perspective who you are in light of who I am. And that's why he talks with such hyperbole, such overstatement. Well, I struggle with that self-importance and with that self-reliance. And they did too. And I love how patiently Jesus continues to teach, continues to return. And lastly, he talks to them about salt. And it had a real context in their world. It was a purifier. It was a preservative. And he begins with this whole statement about salt with fire's coming. Fire's coming. Persecution is coming. You are going to be revealed for who you are. So pay attention to your saltiness. The purpose of salt is a purifier. It's a flavoring. I think when he talks at the very end about being at peace with one another, he's saying pay attention to how you flavor your life and you flavor the lives around you. And lastly, this is the what do I do with it part. Well, I said I need to pay attention to the impact I bring, the flavor I bring to myself, my own life. What flavor do I desire in my own life and the lives around me? That I need to pay attention to what kind of Messiah I'm serving. He's a suffering servant, not a triumphant hero. I need to enjoy the mountaintops, but remember they are but a glimpse, that I can't stay there. I need to desire a growing faith and a prayerfully dependent life. And I need to be very aware of the danger of my own attitude. And I can only do this if I follow God's command to listen. I am praying for you that you will open this with an open heart and an open mind, and in it that you will find God's great truth. I'll see you next week. We are moving to the book of Matthew, chapter 5.